Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Truth Noir. We have a very special guest tonight. I've seen him speak a couple times, and he's extremely knowledgeable about a great number of topics. And he's here to share some of that information with you. Most of it I've never heard before. Like, I always learn a lot when he's on. And so I'd like to welcome him to the show. This is Atelston Fitzgerald Holder the First. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me.
So I've heard you speak about spectrum disorders like autism, global consciousness, computer technology, like just all over the place. And so what is it that you'd like to speak to us about tonight?
Today, probably an extension. I did a 1-hour lecture on drone box. Previously, taking a cross-disciplinary, a multidisciplinary, a transdisciplinary, and also an interdisciplinary approach to mental disorder, where I approach mental disorder from 10 key areas: philosophical analysis, psychological analysis, a physics analysis, a musical theoretical analysis, a linguistic analysis, a parapsychological, psychopathological, a pathophysiological, a neurological approach, and a geophysics approach. And it was basically a 1-hour discussion covering mental disorder from all these different disciplines. And today I would probably like to, maybe an extension of it, or possibly see whatever direction this goes in.
Sure, yeah, I'm down for that as well. I have worked with kids in the past that had autism, and I never saw a case, like I never saw two kids that ever had the same kind of symptoms or like anything resembling the other child that also had a diagnosis with autism. There's always something new. And so, like, do you have any theories on how this manifests in so many kids these days? Because it seems like statistically the numbers have been going up.
I would probably use the X-Men analogy, where it's quite conspicuous that there's some sort of biological evolution occurring with the X-Men, and no two gifts are identical, but it's clearly they're X-Men. So from that perspective, what you find with not just neurotypicals, but atypicals. No, I'm not an expert in this area because my views are based from a self-referential, which is sort of subjective, and empirical analysis only, which is based on a sort of intersubjectivity or the collective view of others who've had the same experience as well. And what I've observed is no two atypicals, even if you look at it from a parapsychological approach or psychopathology, no two of the same bipolar or mania share the exact same phenomenon. So there's a number of different variances. So someone who's going through manic episode and grandiosity, they might have a sort of elated impulsivity. Someone else, promiscuity might ascend off the roof. Someone else might experience a high level of grandiosity, right, which is the augmentation of one's ambition. So it's hard to put it into perspective in terms of what are the commonalities they share. But what you do find is they share a commonality across the board in terms of their emotional attributes, in terms of impulsivity, disinhibition, grandiosity, pathological compulsion, and promiscuity.
And empathy a lot of times too, right?
Yeah, empathy, of course, yeah. And empathy is one of those things I spend extensive time researching in terms of is this biological, is this a biological predisposition, or are there environmental factors involved in terms of what induces this deep-seated level of compassion a person may have for someone else? So, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. What do you think kind of like a common theory is that like vaccines and the frequency and number of vaccines that children have progressively over time been made to take more of. Do you have any opinions on how that, if at all, might be affecting the frequency increase of spectrum cases?
There's a number of different controversies, conspiracies, speculations. I can't determine, I don't know in that sense. And one aspect of these areas I don't invest too much time through also is the epidemiology, the history of the evolution of how it emanated. My infatuation is more within the context of the metaphysical and the phenomenological aspect of mental disorder, because there's a specific type of atypicals or non-neurotypicals who have a sort of tapestry. There's a sort of interconnectivity they have with what we perceive as reality. So my infatuation is in that area itself. When you get into areas like existentialism and epistemology, one idea is solipsism, where a person goes into mania and they take on all these different sort of philosophical approach. One idea of psychoanalysis and psychodynamics, which originated with Sigmund Freud, which is one aspect is the whole idea of the relationship between the subconscious and the conscious. So I find these areas intriguing in terms of when a person's external stimuli is augmented, modified, or augmented, their philosophy change, their ideology of reality change. So those are the areas I find intriguing, and not so much what because there's a sort of dichotomy in terms of what causes certain mental disorder. One is a biological predisposition, and others is environmental factors. I'm not certain, right? It's all relative. It could be a result of post-traumatic stress disorder. It could be substance abuse. It could be insomnia. I mean, one aspect of insomnia is when the circadian rhythm is disrupted, right? And
Right.
the relationship between that, the pineal gland, and the release of melatonin. All these things can induce bipolar. So I'm obsessed with there's a phenomenon with mental disorders. People who are in psychiatric ward, they experience something intriguing.
Yeah, and a lot of the research, it seems, is kind of all over the place. Like, there's a lack of focus, it feels like, or like sort of fragmenting in the method by which certain places like test for certain things.
One of the biggest elephants in the room is quite clear that patterns in nature are undetectable to the unimpaired and uninitiated. And that being said, that a level of impairment and a level of initiation, meaning that access to some sort of deep-seated esoteric or obscure knowledge is required for a person to have these sorts of experiences. And the experts who are making these analyses, they're not impaired, right? So they don't have, right? So they're not in the same exact predicament. So they're making this evaluation from a lack of impairment and from a lack of initiation. So this is one of the biggest irony, right? So.
Yeah, it is an odd paradox that the ones who are unable to see it are the ones testing for it.
Right, it's a big
and trying
irony.
to detect it in ways that what philosophical systems do you think, or are you familiar with like comparative mythologies at all, or
Very little.
are there any of the world religions that you think get closer to the truth than any other?
Wow, that's when you look at nihilism postulates that the universe has no inherent or intrinsic meaning, right? And constructing meaning in a universe that has no intrinsic meaning is a meaningless process. Absolutism sort of have the same philosophy, but from the perspective of trying to construct a narrative in a universe that's inherently meaningless is in conflict or contradiction to the meaninglessness of the universe.
Right.
Existentialism now takes this approach well, if the universe is inherently meaningless based on free will and personal responsibility, human beings have a moral obligation to subjectively construct a meaningful narrative in what's deemed objectively chaotic. So these are some of the philosophical ideas of reality. Then you have ideas like pantheism, which postulates that the universe is synonymous with an external divine intervention. Then
And every part thereof is holy because it's part of the whole.
Right, and then you have panentheism, which adds a second layer by postulating that an external divine intervention interpenetrates the universe, simultaneously existing outside space and time, right? Then we have panpsychism or panpsychism. I could never pronunciate a lot of these philosophical terms, right? Which postulates that all matter on a universal, primitive, primordial level has ingrained some level of consciousness on an infinitesimal level. So when you look at pantheism, you look at panentheism, and you look like panpsychism, they all have this sort of philosophy of an external divine intervention, but from quite a peculiar perspective.
Sure.
Pantheism has this idea of synonymous with divinity. Panentheism have this internal, external, intrinsic, extrinsic factor. And panpsychism has this philosophy of consciousness existing on an infinitesimal level. Now, when we get into areas like animism, right, which sort of implements a spirit and a soul in what's tangible or intangible, inanimate or inanimate, organic or inorganic, right, this sort of encapsulates matter, non-matter, physical, non-physical, and things that move and things that don't move.
Yeah, spiritual and temporal.
Right. And then Gnosticism, of course, which is sort of affinitized to mythological mediums. So when you look at it objectively, it's hard to give an objective analysis of what reality is or what it is we're experiencing, because everyone have quite a peculiar idea of what reality is. And I mean, look at solipsism. Solipsism has this postulation that all external stimuli is a mirrored reflection or projection or a manifestation of one's imagination. And
Yeah, like that you really do create your own reality by the act of perception.
Right. And solipsism is one of those unfinished or faulty philosophy because it's paradoxical, because it doesn't take into account intersubjectivity phenomenology.
Right.
Metaphysical solipsism postulates that only the mind exists. I could only prove that the mind exists. Epistemological solipsism postulates that I cannot prove with absolute certainty that other minds exist. So this is where the paradox derives when you get into intersubjectivity phenomenology, because right. So what it's doing, it's not taking collective consciousness into consideration. It's invalidating that, and this is one of the paradoxes of solipsism. So during mania, during grandiosity or augmentation of one's ambition, when someone is experiencing elation during manic episodes, they kind of disperse into all these different philosophical areas. Ideas like animism and hylozoism actually is a philosophy I didn't mention, which the perception of things being alive. And one idea is psychedelic induction, where a person may take on this whole animalistic or philosophy where they feel the spirit, where their empathy sort of emanates, and they could feel the spirit and the soul of the plant.
Yeah, and like there's a lot of I guess go to a sort of biomass model where like there's a lot of plants that grow that will get you high and that will kill pain and that will treat certain inflammations, or like the plants do all kinds of stuff, and there's all kinds of plants that do those individual things, but there are very few living substances on the earth that will produce that sort of psychoactive response in the brain of like feeling of oneness, empathy, like major expansion of consciousness. Like there's maybe only two, right?
Yeah, what happens is, again, I always use neurotypical in the sense that everyone who falls within the category of normalism, normalism is basically the euphemism. It seems under psychedelic induction, the subconscious and the conscious sort of germinate, and it creates some sort of, it becomes blurred. And again, I always make reference to mania, because when that area germinates, what's intrinsic becomes extrinsic, and there's no differentiation. Hence the reason they end up in psychiatric ward, because once external stimuli are altered, modified, or augmented, there's a number of different phenomena that occur. One is apophenia, pareidolia, hallucination, delusion, psychosis, and schizophrenia. Right, and these are all different perceptions of reality. And the psychedelic sort of brings that, and that experience only derives from that sort of altered state.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We had some pictures that you'd found. You want to go through those one by one and talk about them, or?
Yeah. Those pictures was for one of the discussion I wanted to mention is certain ideas of philosophy in terms of what occurs with mental disorder, in terms of ideas like dualism and monism. One idea is dualism postulates that there are rigid distinctions between mind and body, whereas monism, is that the pronunciation?
Yeah.
Postulates that these rigid distinctions between mind and body are part of the exact same phenomenon, or underlying epiphenomenon, or whatever you call it. So I came up with this postulation that, there's this rivalry between dualism and monism, although there's many different variances of dualism and many different variances of monism. But in the rough sense, dualism is sort of paradoxical. So it's both dualism and it's both monism simultaneously. I think the problem is human beings are biologically predisposed to absolutes, and we find ambiguity discombobulating, right?
Yeah, making choices is a little bit harder than than having your path set out clearly before you.
Yeah, when we proceed back to our primordial era, our survival mechanism was contingent on absolutes. If you hear a rattle in the bush, you have two options. Either you stay and die, or you want to survive. So,
right.
And because of our inability and we being predisposed to absolute, what it's sort of, it kind of, it removes us from the ability to explore the multiple variances. And I think the reason why dualism is paradoxical is because we have to look at it from a completely different perspective. And, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's all fascinating stuff, and like the fact that to this day, in what you would think is like the late date of our societal evolution, that like there's still these very disjunct philosophical tropes going on in society still. And how is it that they haven't gotten resolved yet? But I mean, each one of them poses a really interesting way of looking at reality. And is it set before us? Do we create it? What does it mean if we do? Is the universe a giant hologram? Like, there's so many interesting.
Yeah. I read Michael Talbot's holographic universe.
Yeah, it's a trip, 80s. Right?
I read it at least 4 times, and this is the whole postulation of the universe being a solid projection or a very convincing illusion or just a beautiful display of the subconscious or whatever is intrinsic. I mean, that's a fascinating, all of these ideas, all of these philosophical, I'm a pragmatist, you know, and I'm sort of indifferent. I don't validate or invalidate. Here's a discussion, let's look at it objectively and subjectively, whether we can quantify or we can't quantify it, whether it's outside or inside the realm of scientific analysis. But back to dualism, this is an image of so you have a beautiful woman, simultaneously you're looking at a saxophone player.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Negative space versus...
Yeah. So that's ambiguity. Ambiguity is when we have two image superimposed, but they cannot be viewed simultaneously. We can look at each image independently, but it's paradoxical because it's two distinct, mutually exclusive images coexisting simultaneously.
So now, what does it say about your psyche when you see one or the other first?
This postulates a lot. This gives us a much more visual understanding of not just ambiguity, but a visual understanding of paradoxes. Although paradoxes and ambiguity are mutually exclusive and they share no relationship whatsoever. Paradoxes are sort of predicated on contradictory, right? Although there's different sorts of paradoxes. You have paradoxes deriving from precondition, prerequisite, you have immutable deductive laws, you have frame of references, and then you have ambiguity, which means indecisiveness, uncertainty, vagueness, or triple or more interpretation. So, but they sort of coincide depending on what context they're in. The reason I mentioned this image specifically is to highlight the whole idea of duality being paradoxical in the sense that I'll make a reference, I'll make an emotional analogy. Let's say I am the source and you are the subject. If I place my hand on the subject's hand,
Okay.
if there's no empathy in my mind, right, there's a very high chance, invariably, induction is not induced. If there's empathy in my mind, then seduction can be induced from the source to the subject. So this postulates two ideas, that there are rigid distinctions between mind and body, and there are no rigid distinctions between mind and body. So what determines the dualistic experience between my mind and the body of the subject is a frame of reference. And I derive this frame of reference from physics by studying immutable deductive laws. And I wouldn't go into the specific paradoxes in physics because there's a lot of jargon and verbosity, but I'll use a reference in terms of, from my perspective, this is the left. From the audience perspective, this is the right.
Correct.
So is this left or right? It's not left, it's not right. It is left, it is right. It's a paradoxical scenario.
Yeah, it is many different things at once, mathematically speaking.
Right, so we call this a relativistic viewpoint deriving from a frame of reference. This paradoxical or contradictory derives from frame of reference. And it's sort of the same with kind of dualism where, well, maybe it's not dualism. Maybe there are no rigid distinctions, and there are, but they occur, they coexist simultaneously, and they work together in harmony. I mean, when you look at light and the wave-particle duality, I mean, you have a positive and negative charge in electricity, and magnetism, you have force and repulsion. So you see this contradictory. Even Newton's third law of motion, which says that every force or action is contingent or conducive on an equal reactive force.
Right.
So you need this sort of kind of opposition. Can I see the next image, please? The next ambiguous image. Thank you. Here's another prime example where you have...
So this one's classic. You see the two people looking at each other, and then in the middle you see like a candlestick or a vase.
Hourglass.
Or some hourglass, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So you can't encapsulate the overall image. You have to view the faces independently.
Yeah, by themselves or...
Yeah, right. They cannot be observed simultaneously. And you also find what's interesting in a prime example is idealism and materialism. Idealism postulates that mind, thoughts, and experience is the fundamental substance in the universe. Materialism postulates that because of the physical body and the physical brain and the electrical charges or the billions of neurons firing between synapses, this implicates the emergence of mind, thoughts, experience, beliefs, emotions, and feelings. So there's a sort of kind of rivalry also between idealism and materialism. But this is not so much a paradoxical scenario. This is more a rivalry between primary substance. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at idealism and materialism objectively, they both agree on the same philosophy. But it's just the debate here, the conundrum here is between the former and the latter, which is the primary substance in the universe.
Yeah, because the implications are heavy and different on one side or the other.
Right. Which I kind of deem irrelevant if they're contingent on each other. They require each other to coexist.
Right.
Right. So it's more seems like
yet another paradox.
Right. It seems like an argument from ego.
Alrighty, sir. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. Do we have more pictures to look at, or?
Yeah, probably one more.
Okay.
Yeah, another prime example of ambiguity.
Oh, right. I like this one too. So you see either a duck or a rabbit. I think I probably saw the rabbit first.
Yeah. You see, so paradoxes is a very difficult concept to grasp, but once you grasp it, it allows you to not put things into perspective, but learn to appreciate things with open interpretation. A prime example is if the Grim Reaper dies, does that constitute a situational irony? Well, you help me answer that. If the Grim Reaper dies, does that constitute a situational irony? The Grim Reaper dies as a paradoxical scenario.
Yeah, because then the dead can't die, right? So do they remain suffering? Do they not get to move on to the place where they're going to afterwards?
Yeah. The problem with if the Grim Reaper dies is the Grim Reaper is a alive, personified version of death.
Right.
Right. But simultaneously, it is the mythology of death itself. So the Grim Reaper is that's why you will never find a situational irony in a paradox, because situational irony is contingent on a set of preconditions. There's a number of prerequisites have to be met for situational, because situational irony is a contrast of what's expected or anticipated.
Right.
So there's a number of prerequisite contrast required. Paradoxes are open to too many different interpretations. So that's why when a person asks me, a student asked me one time, if the Grim Reaper dies, does that constitute a situational irony? If the Grim Reaper dies, it's a paradoxical problem, because the Grim Reaper is both, what's the dead cat? I forgot his name.
Schrödinger.
The Schrödinger
Right.
cat experiment. Right. So Grim Reaper is dead and alive simultaneously. Another paradox is in music, musical octaves. So an A chord consists of 440 hertz. When you double the A chord, you get 880 hertz. So you're hearing the same note, but at a much higher frequency.
Right. Double the frequency.
Double the frequency. So there's a sort of contradictory. I can't believe 1 hour went by so fast.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, it was fascinating.
Yeah.
We got, was this the last of our pictures?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Oh, no, we got an elephant with a tuba head.
Oh, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, this is a surrealism. Right. It kind of proceeds back to one of my favorite surrealists is Salvador Dali, which is the all-encompassing of surrealism.
Yeah, lots of hidden stuff, like the elk's or the deer's antlers are shaped like a harp.
Yeah, they call it the juxtaposition of incongruity.
Right.
Which is the merging of the incompatible, placing things that are mutually exclusive side by side and finding a commonality they share, right? And somehow they create this there's a consonance in the art itself, right? So, and this is what Salvador Dali did in the Renaissance era. What he did was he juxtaposed the subconscious and the dream state. I think it's unfortunate we didn't have time to get into Sigmund Freud's idea of ego and the superego, and so some key areas in psychoanalysis and psychodynamics I wanted to explore.
Yeah, it's kind of like elementary, but it's still, like, a lot of it still is very relevant.
Oh yeah.
As far as like personality traits and stuff. So you have to take the good with the bad as far as
I felt like I didn't give you a chance to talk.
Oh no, it was my pleasure, man. Like I said, I've been wanting to have you on for a while, and I'm glad it worked out this week. So yeah, man. One last question before we break. What's your opinion of the concept that there is only one of us in the room? Like the sort of group consciousness being a singularity expressing and experiencing itself in different ways.
This receives right back to that whole paradox of dualism, where we're mutually exclusive, simultaneously part of the same underlying epiphenomenon. I'm open to two things, ambiguity and paradoxes. And that question you asked, I see it in terms of open to many interpretations. So I may walk out this door and we may have no commonalities whatsoever, but at the same time there's a tapestry between us.
Exactly.
So it's two things at once and more. If we remove ourselves from these sort of biological predispositions to absolutes and see things for the multiple variances they are.
Yeah, you could go nuts thinking about it because there's a lot of different ways to look at it. But yeah, so we'll go ahead and call it a day there. Thank you once again, Atelston. It was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for sharing all of your wisdom with us.
Thank you.
We will be... Hi, there we go. We'll be back here next week with more weird stuff. I don't know exactly what it'll be yet because I just, put these shows together like a day ahead of time. So wherever you're going, get there safe. We'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.
This was such an insane episode.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. At one point, I didn't know what direction we were going.
I think it fit together pretty well.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you for having me.